in the Shadows, Part 5, The Desperate Flight. On the narrow landing of Garwood's apartment stairwell, Olivia clutched the railing, her knuckles white against the chipped paint. Below them, the echo of heavy boots thundered upward, relentless and closing in. Above, shadows moved, Carlucci's men descending fast, their voices barking orders. The air was suffocating, thick with the dust of the old building and the mounting dread of no escape. Thaddeus pressed his back to the wall, his chest heaving as his mind raced. They were trapped, boxed in by danger from both directions. His gaze darted to Olivia, her wide, terrified eyes searching his for a solution. Time seemed to freeze, and in the stillness, inspiration struck. "Hold tight," Thaddeus growled, his voice low and urgent. Before Olivia could question him, he seized her around the waist, pulling her into a firm embrace. With a sharp pivot, he launched himself backwards straight through the dirty window behind him. The world erupted into chaos. The brittle glass shattered in a cascade of jagged shards, catching the dim light as they fell. Olivia's scream was muffled against Thaddeus's chest as they hurtled into the frigid night. The icy wind bit at their skin, and then they slammed into the decaying wooden staircase outside the building. The rotten boards splintered beneath their weight, breaking their fall with a jarring crash before giving way entirely. They plunged another 10 feet, hitting the sidewalk in a tangled heap. The impact stole the breath from Thaddeus's lungs and sent a searing pain through his arm. He rolled onto his back, grimacing as the realization hit his left arm was broken. Olivia groaned beside him, dazed but miraculously not seriously hurt. Shards of glass sparkled around them, and the scent of wood dust and cold concrete filled the air. Thaddeus forced himself upright, cradling his injured arm, his eyes flicking to the shattered window above. 2 dark silhouettes leaped after them. The men hit the weakened staircase with a thunderous crack. The rotten structure groaned under their combined weight before collapsing entirely. 4 floors of decrepit wood and rusted metal came crashing down, burying the men beneath a mountain of rubble. "Move!" Thaddeus barked, hauling Olivia to her feet as debris rained down around them. They stumbled into the street, narrowly avoiding the cascading wreckage. Gunfire erupted from above, the sharp cracks cutting through the chaos. Olivia let out a startled cry and bolted, darting across the street toward the shadowed mouth of an alley. Thaddeus followed, every step sending fresh waves of agony through his arm. The cold air burned his throat, but he pushed forward, adrenaline overriding pain. They ran without looking back, weaving through the desolate streets as the sounds of pursuit faded into the distance. They fled past boarded-up storefronts and into the maze of the rail yards, the looming silhouettes of train cars and abandoned machinery their only cover. Each step was a battle, but neither dared to stop until the river came into view. At the edge of the Missouri, they collapsed onto the muddy bank. The icy water lapped at the shore, chunks of ice drifting lazily downstream. Thaddeus scanned the darkness, his sharp eyes locking onto a small boat pulled up onto the shore. "Over there," he said, his voice hoarse. Together they dragged themselves to the boat, climbing inside and pulling the tarp over their shivering bodies. It was no refuge from the biting cold, but it offered a thin veil of protection. Olivia huddled close to Thaddeus, her body trembling not only from the chill but from the overwhelming terror of the night. Silent tears streaked her face as she buried it in his chest. Thaddeus rested his chin on her head, his good arm wrapping around her shoulders. He wanted to speak, to offer some reassurance, but no words came. Pain, exhaustion, and the sheer absurdity of the night's events weighed heavy on him. As the first light of dawn crept over the horizon, the adrenaline ebbed away, and he succumbed to a restless, pain-filled sleep. The sun was low in the western sky when Thaddeus awoke, its fading rays painting the muddy riverbank in hues of gold and pink. Olivia stirred beside him, her tear-streaked face pale but resolute. "We can't stay here," she said softly, her voice raw but steady. "We have to find Cosner. He works with Garwood. He'll know what to do." Thaddeus sat up slowly, his broken arm sending sharp jolts of pain through his body. "Cosner?" he asked, his voice thick with grogginess and confusion. "Who is he? What does he have to do with any of this?" Olivia hesitated, her gaze dropping to the floor of the boat. He's Garwood's friend, she said finally, and we need him because Garwood has been taken. Her voice cracked, and she drew a shaky breath before continuing. Carlucci's men have him. If we don't find Cosner and get help, they'll kill him, if they haven't already. Thaddeus frowned, his brows knitting together. Why would they take him? What does Carlucci want with you? I need answers, Olivia. She met his gaze, her green eyes shining with urgency. Carlucci kidnapped me because I look like his mistress. He was using me as bait in some scheme to draw out an Irish gang that was trying to leverage her against him. I was just a pawn to him, but Garwood found me. He saved me. Her voice faltered. And now he's paying the price. Thaddeus exhaled slowly, his mind piecing together the puzzle. Then we go, he said, his tone firm. We find Cosner and go to the police. They'll help us. Darkness was falling as the two climbed the riverbank, their breaths visible in the frosty air. Unbeknownst to them, in the heart of the city, a weak but steadfast Garwood and concerned and enraged Cosner were tearing through the streets, desperate to find Olivia before it was too late. Garwood sat slumped against the cold, unforgiving wall of the library's recessed doorway, nursing the last few bitter dregs of his coffee, his breath misted in the frigid air, each exhale a testament to his exhaustion. Every fiber of his body screamed at him to stop, his wounds pulsing in time with his heartbeat, his limbs heavy with fatigue, but his mind would not allow surrender. Somewhere out there, Olivia was either running or trapped, and Garwood couldn't bear the thought of failing her. Hours of searching had brought them nothing but dead ends. Informants were either silent, scared, or gone. The streets were tight-lipped, and even the faint glimmers of hope seemed too elusive to grasp. Cosner, still alert despite the late hour, paced the width of the entryway. His energy, though outwardly unwavering, was threaded with frustration. The dress shop, he said finally, breaking the silence. The girls there said, Olivia left with someone yesterday. Garwood's gaze shifted, sharp and probing. Who? Thaddeus Gerard, delivery boy, paper goods. Garwood straightened as best he could, ignoring the pull of his wounds. Thaddeus Gerard. He had seen him before, a lanky kid who made deliveries to the shop. Garwood had once noted the stolen glances exchanged between him and Olivia. He dismissed them then, chalking it up to the harmless flirtations of youth. But now... He's a kid, Garwood muttered, shaking his head. Carlucci wouldn't let some delivery boys stand in his way. If Gerard got in the way, he's dead, or worse. Cosner hesitated. And Olivia? Garwood's jaw tightened. He forced himself to steel his thoughts. She could have escaped, but... He paused, his voice lowering into something more haunted. Don't count on it. Carlucci wouldn't stop until he had her. If she's still out there, we don't have time to lose. As if summoned by the tension in Garwood's voice, a shadow stirred across the street. Garwood tensed immediately, his hand instinctively moving to the butt of his pistol. Cosner, he said sharply, jerking his chin toward the approaching figure. In the dim light, the silhouette shuffled closer, low and hunched. A voice broke the stillness, smooth and mocking. Now, Garwood, you wouldn't shoot me, now would you? Garwood narrowed his eyes, his grip relaxing slightly. Creepy, he muttered. It was Christopher Howes, better known by the nickname he had earned through his slick but unsettling demeanor. Creepy was a con artist, a scavenger of street whispers, and, on occasion, a reluctant ally for a price. Cosner remained on edge, his hand hovering near his weapon. Garwood signaled him to stand down but didn't let his guard drop entirely. What are the streets saying tonight, Creepy? He asked, his tone sharp and thinly veiled with warning. Creepy flashed a grin, the dim light catching on his uneven teeth. Oh, I don't know, detective, he replied, dragging out the word with theatrical emphasis. Maybe the streets say you and your pup here are looking for the girl. Maybe they say Carlucci and his boys are looking for her too. Garwood's heart leapt, but his face betrayed nothing. Maybe, he said coolly. Maybe, Creepy continued, I saw her. Maybe I saw the boy with her, not 10 minutes ago. He paused, his grin widening as he added, Maybe you pay me, and I'll tell you where. How much? Garwood snapped. Creepy shrugged nonchalantly, his voice taking on a sing-song quality. Oh, I don't know. Prices have gone up, seeing as how you got Manny killed. He never finished. Cosner moved like a predator, grabbing Creepy by the collar and slamming him against the wall. The revolver was in Creepy's mouth before he could react, his eyes wide with shock and fear. Maybe, Cosner said, his voice low and deadly. The next words out of your mouth are where you saw them. Maybe if they're not, I'll blow your head off. How's that for a price? Creepy froze, his hands trembling in surrender. Cosner eased the gun back just enough for him to speak. 6 blocks north, he stammered. They were heading north, the boy and your girl. Garwood stepped forward, pressing a crumpled $5 bill into Creepy's shaking hand. Thanks, Creepy, he said flatly before turning to Cosner. Let's go. Later, Garwood would have to talk with Cosner about how to get information, but that could wait. The two men took off at a sprint, the cold air burning in Garwood's lungs as he pushed his body to its limit. His injuries were screaming now, his vision threatening to tunnel, but his determination refused to let him falter. Ahead, a familiar figure appeared under the flickering street light. Fitz, Garwood called, his voice hoarse but commanding. Come with us, she's close. Detective O'Malley looked up, his weary face lighting with surprise at the sight of Garwood and Cosner. Without hesitation, he joined them, breaking into a run alongside the pair. How do you know? He panted. Garwood didn't answer, his focus entirely on the path ahead. They rounded a corner, and the sight before them brought all 3 men skidding to a halt. Salvatore Carlucci stood in the center of the street, flanked by 15 of his men. Olivia was held tightly by one of them, her arms wrenched behind her back as Carlucci gripped her chin in his hand, leering at her with cruel amusement. Against the brick wall, Thaddeus was pinned by 2 burly enforcers as a third beat him mercilessly. Blood streaked the boy's face, his head lolling weakly under the repeated blows. Carlucci! Garwood's roar split the air, silencing the chaos. Carlucci turned, his face contorting into a twisted grin. Well, well, he sneered. If it isn't the great Garwood, you think you can. The mob boss's taunt was cut short by the bark of Garwood's revolver. The shot was clean and precise, catching Carlucci between the eyes. His body crumpled to the ground, lifeless. In the split second of stunned silence that followed, Garwood moved like a storm. His revolver fired again and again, each shot finding its mark. The men closest to Olivia fell before they could react, their bodies collapsing around her. Cosner and O'Malley drew their weapons, shouting commands as the remaining gangsters froze, their will to fight evaporating in the face of the detective's fury. One by one, they dropped their weapons, their hands rising in surrender. Olivia, trembling, stumbled forward, her wide, tear-filled eyes locking onto Garwood. She broke into a run, throwing herself into his arms with a sob. Garwood wrapped her in a protective embrace, ignoring the searing pain in his body as he held her tightly. Officers and detectives swarmed the streets in a blur of uniforms and voices, the air heavy with the smell of cordite and the distant echo of sirens. Amid the chaos, Thaddeus sat slumped on the back bumper of an ambulance, his face pale and his arm immobilized in a makeshift sling. Blood caked his temple, and his shirt was torn and stained with sweat and grime. A paramedic worked hurriedly to stabilize his injuries, but Thaddeus barely noticed. His dark eyes scanned the crowd, searching, desperate. He caught a glimpse of Olivia, standing a short distance away, her thin frame dwarfed by the imposing figure of Garwood and the steadfast presence of Cosner. Relief surged through him at the sight of her unharmed, but it was quickly swallowed by frustration. "She's right there," Thaddeus shouted, attempting to stand. The paramedic pushed him back firmly. "Not with that arm, you're not," the medic scolded. "You're headed to the hospital. Broken radius, possibly dislocated shoulder, and God knows what else. You're lucky you're even conscious." Thaddeus grit his teeth, glaring at the medic. "I don't care about my arm. I need to talk to her." The paramedic glanced at him, unimpressed. "Listen, kid, you've been through hell. You'll get your chance, but not tonight." Before Thaddeus could argue further, the doors of the ambulance swung shut and the vehicle pulled away, leaving him fuming and helpless. he swore under his breath, gripping the edge of the stretcher so tightly his knuckles turned white. "I'll talk to her," he muttered. "I'll find her, and I'll say what I need to." Hours later, back at the precinct, Garwood, Olivia, and Cosner arrived in a haze of exhaustion. The cold, sterile air of the police department offered no comfort, the sharp contrast to the chaos of the streets outside leaving Olivia feeling hollow. She sat at a desk, her hands wrapped tightly around a cup of coffee she had no intention of drinking. A plate of sandwiches lay untouched in front of her, though the grumble of her stomach betrayed her. "Eat something," Cosner said gruffly, sinking into the chair beside her. "I can't," Olivia whispered, staring into the dark surface of the coffee. Her voice was barely audible, and her shoulders sagged under the weight of her exhaustion. Cosner glanced at her, his tone softening slightly. "You've got to keep your strength up, kid. Garwood wouldn't want you running yourself into the ground." At the mention of Garwood's name, Olivia's gaze darted to the closed door of the interview room. "He's been in there forever," she murmured. "What could they possibly still need to know?" Cosner leaned back in his chair with a weary sigh. "O'Malley's thorough. Garwood's not exactly in the habit of keeping things simple either." Inside the room, Garwood finished the last line of his statement with a slow, deliberate movement. He set the pen down, his hand trembling slightly from both exhaustion and the dull ache of his injuries. Across the table, O'Malley watched him with a scrutinizing gaze, the corners of his mouth pulled into a grim line. "You look like you've been dragged through a field, Garwood," O'Malley said, breaking the silence. Garwood met his eyes, his expression impassive. "I feel worse." O'Malley watched him for a long moment before speaking. "Garwood, I'll never understand how you do it. If I live to be 100, I won't." He paused, leaning forward. "But why? Why do you care so much about this godforsaken cowtown?" Garwood met O'Malley's gaze again, his voice quiet but resolute. "Because someone has to." O'Malley shook his head, a faint smile tugging at his lips. "You're a damn fool," he muttered. As Garwood rose to leave, O'Malley stopped him. "Wait. There's something you should know. Fletcher escaped last night." Garwood's expression didn't change, but his silence spoke volumes. He nodded once before leaving the room. Back in the main room, Olivia flinched at the sound of the interview room door opening. Garwood stepped out, his presence commanding even in his battered state. He looked at her, and for a moment, the weight of the world seemed to lift from her shoulders. "What happens now?" she asked, her voice fragile. "We go home," Garwood said simply, his tone as steady as a rock. She frowned, her brows knitting together. "I can't go back to my parents, not after all this." Garwood shook his head. "Not there. Your apartment, then? Is it safe?" Garwood hesitated, his expression softening. "Not there either." "Then where? Somewhere safe, somewhere you don't have to look over your shoulder." She nodded, trusting him despite her uncertainty. As the two walked out into the cold night, Olivia glanced over her shoulder, her thoughts drifting to Thaddeus. She hadn't had the chance to thank him, to say the things she needed to say. But she promised herself she would, soon. For now the shadows of the city stretched long before them, and the road ahead was uncertain. But for the first time in days, Olivia felt a glimmer of hope. Garwood knew there would still be more battles to fight, more men like Carlucci, more loose ends like Fletcher, but Garwood knew whatever lay ahead, he would fight. Fight for Olivia Parkhurst, fight for Cosner Davis, fight for Marie and Katie Garwood, and he would fight for Kansas City. Carlucci had called him the last good man in a rotten city. If that is true, then every city would be lucky to have their own Beauregard Tecumseh Garwood, or at least someone like him, someone willing to do battle with the shadows.